Welcome to Thoughts of War. My name is Bart, a nonviolent follower of Jesus. This will be a follow-up to my Augustine Part 1 video. And so if you've not watched it, please go back and watch that one first. So what I want to look at today is killing in the name of God. And have you ever wondered how the followers of Christ has done the most horrible things throughout history? And I just made a list here. You can go look in your history books, Google stuff. You'll without a doubt find all of these things throughout history. So with Protestants in the United States supporting the antebellum slave trade, the Protestants and Catholics killing each other on the battlefield of Europe and all over the world. Germany and Rwanda, they were considered Christian countries at the times that they committed their atrocities. So you had Catholics killing other Catholics and Protestants killing Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox killing each other. You have the Crusades and the Inquisition, where there's violence against Jews, against Muslims, violence against other Christians. Through the years, you've had violence against the LGBTQ community. You've had the violence against other religions. And so I ask you, do you ever wonder how can we get from the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament to justifying so many killings and murderous acts done by people who claim to be the followers of Jesus? And so if you look at the New Testament real quick, this is why I bring this up, because the New Testament does cover church discipline. How do you discipline somebody who has sinned or who are living in sin? And Jesus is pretty clear on these teachings. In Matthew 18, 15, 17, it says, "Let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you." And so the main thing I want to point there is Jesus didn't say to kill them, didn't say to stone them. And just to say they're like a Gentile or tax collector, that doesn't mean you never speak with them, or you spit at them, or you treat them with disgust, or you try to cheat them out of money. It's nothing like that. It just means you don't fellowship with them. Means you don't go eat with them. You don't hang out with them as you would almost like anyway. So in 1 Corinthians 5 talks about a person who's living in sexual morality. Paul says don't even eat with such a person. And 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11 says this punishment by the majority is sufficient for that person. So whenever the church just pulls away their fellowship from somebody, what Jesus and Paul and the early Christians hoped would be that person, where they're living without that safety net of the church around them, and that they would see what life was like outside of living as part of the church, and that they would confess their sins and come back into the church. But it was never to give them any type of physical punishment or harm. As a matter of fact, Jesus taught Matthew 5:44, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. So Paul wasn't saying, and Jesus wasn't saying, you don't pray for them. If Jesus is teaching you love your enemies, you for sure love a brother in Christ that's living in sin and is rejecting some basic teachings. You for sure love them, even if you may not fellowship with them, you may not hang out with them, but you for sure love them, and you for sure pray for them because you're hoping they come back into the church. That's the whole goal, is to bring them back into the church. But the bottom line is, if you look in the early church, in the New Testament teachings, there's nothing about killing someone who's living in sexual immorality or killing someone who has rejected the teachings of Jesus. And so the question is, how do we have centuries of Christians seem to be doing that exact same thing, to be persecuting others who do not have the exact faith that they do? And you may say, Bart, I don't know if you can make the jump and just go back to just one person, but I kind of feel like Augustine is that one person we can mostly go back to. And the reason I say that is, watch my previous videos. I've done a whole series on the early church. And I'm pretty clear on those teachings that the early church taught to lay down your swords and beat your swords into plowshares. So what happened? What changed? What happened to where the church can now justify violence? So Augustine lived in the late 4th century into the early 5th century, and he was the one who wrote The City of God, and in it he talks about just wars. And so Christians today have been, even today, still talk about just wars. How can you do war justly? And what do you do after war? How just the just process of war? How can you only fight defensive wars? Only target combatants. You cannot target non-combatants. So all this goes back to Augustine. And if you read anything about should Christians fight in war, they'll always go back to Augustine. It should be a flag to you that they're going back to the 4th century and early 5th century. I want you yourself to go research this. What happened before the 4th and 5th century? What did Christians do? Go research this. Why are they going back to Augustine? And you'll see clearly why they go back to him. And so we're going to use one document that Augustine wrote. I'm going back to, like I did in my part 1, to a treatise concerning the correction of the Donatists. And I'm not going to talk about the Donatist beliefs, if they're right, if they're wrong. I'm just want to talk about Augustine's logic and how he deals with the Donatists and how the recommendations he makes to Boniface. He's a Roman general and the governor of Africa. I just want to look at the recommendations that Augustine makes. And to me, think about all those evils that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. How can all those be justified? I think you can see from Augustine's logic, although Augustine I don't think meant for all those evil things to occur in the later centuries, but to me he laid the theological foundation to all kinds of atrocities. And how did he do that? Let's go see. And I also want you to know, first, always double check anything I'm telling you. Go back, read the original sources, and see if what I'm telling you is right. But I'm going to go to Augustine concerning the correction of the Donatists, and I'm going to his chapter 2 there, and part 10 there. It says, "But if they think that no one can be justified in using violence, as they said in the course of the conference, that the true church must necessarily be the one which suffers persecution, not the one inflicting it." So I'm going to go back to here. So there are Christians, just making this point, there are Christians living the time of Augustine who says that Christians should be the ones suffering persecution, not the ones inflicting it. Go back to my early videos. Go back and read what those early Christians wrote. Does this sound like what the early Christians taught? I think it does. But let's look at Augustine. How does he say, well, it's time for Christians to act differently from now on? In which after this point, Christians do act differently from now on. So let's look. "But this I say, I forbear to urge, yet one point I must press. If the true church is the one which actually suffers persecution, not the one which inflicts it, again I ask, if good and holy men never inflict persecution upon anyone, but only suffer it, whose words they think that those are in the psalm where we read, I have pursued mine enemies and overtaken them, neither did I turn again till they were consumed." So Augustine starts bringing in the Old Testament. And this is still going to be true today. A lot of times when Christians justify being part of the military, they often reference back to the Old Testament and how God used soldiers in the Old Testament to bring about justice. And so Augustine, this is kind of laying that foundation. Same thing that Christians do today. They look at the Old Testament and they see, hey, God supported war in the Old Testament. He allowed for war in the Old Testament. Why would he not allow for war now? So he lays that foundation. And so if you're watching this and you believe that Christians should participate in war, I want you to first decide, are you going to agree with Augustine on his logic of why Christians should participate in war? Just right now, just think about, are you going to agree with Augustine? And so as we go through this video, I want you to follow his logic and see if you still follow that same logic when we get done. So here we go. It says, "If therefore we wish either to declare or to recognize the truth, there is a persecution of unrighteousness." So Augustine means there is a time where the unrighteous needs to be persecuted. What which the impious inflict upon the church of Christ. And there is a righteous persecution, which the church of Christ inflicts upon the impious. Stop there for a second. Let me read that again. There is a righteous persecution, which the church of Christ inflicts upon the impious. So he's flipping it. He's saying now the church of Christ can inflict persecution, and that it's okay. Now, he'll make the point that the unrighteous don't do it correctly. They're doing it out of hatred, out of mean. But the church of Christ, when we persecute others, it says we do it in the spirit of love, that we do it that the church may correct the behavior. The church of Christ persecutes so that they may recall from error. The church persecutes that her enemies and arrest them until they become weary in their vain opinions, so that they should make advance in the truth. We make measures for their good to secure their eternal salvation. And it says the church endeavors to deliver them from that destruction so that none of them should die. So this is going to sound kind of weird, but Augustine is going to be pointing out that the church persecutes non-believers for their good. The church persecutes non-believers because it loves them. So you can automatically see how this could go wrong, especially in the later centuries. But as to the argument of those men who are unwilling that their impious deeds should be checked by the enactment of righteous laws, when they say that the apostles never sought such measures from the kings of the earth. Wait, pause again. Again, there's another set of Christians outside of Augustine who are saying that the apostles never sought the government to enforce the New Testament teachings pertaining to sexual morality, to how Christians should live. They never, the apostles never asked the local authorities to pass those laws to make everybody live like the way the Christians lived. The apostles never sought that. But here's the catch. Augustine says that these other Christians, they don't consider that now this is a different character of that age and that everything comes in its own season. So you're going to start seeing Augustine as saying there was a time of the apostles and now there's a different time. During the time of the apostles, that's not the way God wanted Christians to live. Now we're living under a different time. Let's keep going. How do we get to that? How does he make this jump to say Christians weren't supposed to live like this in the past, but they are to live, they are to persecute others now? How does he make that jump? And here's how he makes it. He says, "For what emperor has yet believed in Christ, so as to serve him in the cause of piety by enacting laws against impiety, when as yet the declaration of the prophet was only in the course of its fulfillment? Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." So he quotes Psalm chapter 2. "And there is yet no sign of which is spoken." A little later in the same psalm, he says, "Be wise now, therefore, O you kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling." How then are kings to serve the Lord with fear, except by preventing and chastising with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commandments of the Lord? So he's saying this age of the apostles was a time when the emperors did not accept God. They did not accept his Messiah. Now we're living in a different time. Remember, this is after Constantine. This is after Constantine has seen his vision to put the crosses on the shield and fight in the name of Christianity and of the Christian God. So this is after that time. So now the emperors have accepted God and his Messiah. So now we're living in a different age. So let's go on with this reasoning. So then let's jump into chapter 5. It says, "For a man serves God in one way, and that he is man another way, that he is also king. and that he is man, he serves him by living faithfully. Now I'm going to go through all this, but he goes through and he starts talking about the Old Testament. You can pause this video and read this later. I'll try to put the links to all this in the description. But it mentions Hezekiah, Josiah, Darius, Nebuchadnezzar. But the bottom line is that last bit. Kings can serve the Lord. He's making a point that kings can serve the Lord. I want you to go back and watch my video on the apostolic tradition. And there's a point in there where I mentioned that a military commander or a civic magistrate that wears the purple must resign. So I think the early church taught that if you're in a almost like a king position, you have to resign to join the church. Here, Augustine's saying, no, that's not true anymore. Now you can be the head, the mayor of a city. You can be someone who kills and has the authority of life and death over other people. You can be one of those positions and still be a follower of Christ. So I think Augustine is breaking from the past. And I think he makes it clear that he's breaking from the past because we're living in a different age. So let's go back. Here's where he makes it almost perfectly clear. So if you do not believe that the early Christians were nonviolent, go back to Augustine. Augustine is clearly teaching that, yes, the early Christians were nonviolent. But from this point on, they're not supposed to be nonviolent. So if you debate, did Jesus really teach nonviolent? Did all those guys I quoted in the previous videos, did they really teach nonviolence? There shouldn't be any debate because Augustine, the person that just war theorists use to support their cause, he's clearly teaching that yes, before him, before the kings of Rome, the Roman Empire accepted Christ, yes, the church was nonviolent. Seeing then, here's the big point right here, that the kings of the earth were not yet serving the Lord in the time of the apostles, but were still imagining vain things against the Lord and against his anointed. That all might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, it must be granted that at that time acts of impiety could not possibly be prevented by the laws, but were rather performed under their sanction. For the order of events was then so rolling on that even the Jews were killing those who preached Christ, thinking that they did God service in so doing, just as Christ had foretold, and the heathen raging against the Christians, and the patience of the martyrs was overcoming them all. So Christians used to be martyred. Christians used to be martyred. Think back about the early argument when those other Christians that Augustine is currently debating, saying Christians should be the ones suffering persecution. Here, Augustine is clearly saying that those early Christians did suffer persecution. So it's logic that those other Christians think that, hey, we should be the ones suffering persecutions because that's what has been happening for centuries. We shouldn't be the ones inflicting persecution because that's not how the apostles lived. That's not how their disciples lived. So here is Augustine's logic. But so soon as the fulfillment began of what is written in a later psalm, he don't tell you it's Psalm 72, much later than Psalm 2. All kings shall fall down before him, all nations should serve him. He quotes this verse 70 psalms later, and he says, guess what? Prophecy is fulfilled now. Kings now serve the Messiah. And now he goes through and he says, what sober-minded man could say to the kings, let not any thought trouble you within your kingdom as to who restrains or attacks the church of your Lord. I'm going to quit reading it here, but basically the bottom line is, notice what he's doing. He's saying that prophecy is fulfilled now. The kings of the earth are following Christ. Christians now can't inflict persecution. So if you're someone who believes in the just war theory, do you believe that? Do you believe there is a prophecy that at some point, that Christians at some point were going to have earthly kings that became followers of Jesus, and then at that point, we could then go to war justly? We couldn't do that before. We could only do that once we had a king that was following Jesus. Was that a prophecy that was clear to you in the Old Testament? It wasn't clear to me. Augustine's pointing out something here I don't think I see anywhere in the scriptures. Sounds like to me, we'll get to this later. Just needless to say, I disagree with this interpretation. So, let's look at what we've looked at so far with Augustine. So in the early church, I talk about how Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen, these are Christians who lived in the 2nd century and into the 3rd century. How they believed Isaiah 2 and Micah 4 was a prophecy that was fulfilled in Jesus the Messiah. That his teachings, when they went forth and people learned that his teachings, that they took their swords and they beat them into plowshares. This was not a figurative teaching. This was a literal teaching, and Christians literally did this. This is why it's very clear in the apostolic tradition and in the First Council of Nicaea. We see the things that we see. Speaking of those things, one more is Lactantius. He says specifically that a religion defended by bloodshed and tortures will be polluted and profaned. Think about that for a second. If you try to defend your religion with bloodshed, you're going to end up polluting the religion that you're trying to defend. You think that's happened to Christianity? I do. Apostolic tradition. A military man must not execute men. If he is to remain in the church, that was the requirement. A person desiring to join the military was an automatic rejection. And it specifically says because he despises God. If you wanted to be in the military, you were not considered Christian material. You must have not really given your life to Christ. If you were already in the military and for some reason you could not get out, they gave you the condition that you could stay in because you could do a job that did not require killing. You could stay in the church and you could stay in the military, but you could not kill. In the First Council of Nicaea, any believer that leaves the military and then returns to the military must repent. All of these things are clearly seen. I've done video after video after video on all of these things. And now here we have Augustine, that he confirms everything that I've been saying, that for the centuries leading up to Augustine, Christians did not train for war. They were received persecution, but they did not inflict persecution. And Augustine's logic on this is the fact that there's a prophecy fulfilled that now that you have a king that's accepted the anointed, the Messiah, that now Christians can persecute and kill now. So, Augustine's logic is God requires his followers to live different during different ages. In the Old Testament, God's followers could kill. And he had good kings in the Old Testament that they could, that he could enact just laws. God then, after Jesus, according to Augustine, that then God pretty much did not allow Christians to kill, but that was only for a period of time. That was while the kings of the earth were not underneath Jesus. And then once the king of the earth, Caesar, Constantine, accepted Christ, well, now things are flipped again. Now it's back to the Old Testament where we can kill. So here's what I'm going to just tell you what I think is clever about his logic. He could acknowledge that Isaiah 2 and Micah 4 were fulfilled as prophesied, but then reject it as the current standard for which Christians are to live. So I think the one that's just really cool. He could go back and he could acknowledge that those first 4 centuries and all those writers, he could say those guys were saints. Those martyrs, all those, they were just saints. They taught the right thing, they lived the right life, but now we don't go by their theology anymore. I don't care what Justin Martyr believed theologically pertaining to war. I don't care about what Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. All those guys, I dismiss all of their theology when it comes to Christians participating in the government and participating in war. I reject all of their teachings because we're in a different age now. So, to me, what are the problems of Augustine's logic? So, if you're someone who believes in the just war theory, do you still believe in the reasons for just war according to Augustine? Because Augustine, he jumped from Psalm 2, saying that during the time of the apostles, that the nations raged against the anointed one. And then he said, oh, the prophecy's been fulfilled in Psalm 72, and now we have kings of the earth that do follow Jesus. So, one thing I would say is, Augustine didn't apply Psalm chapter 2, verse 9. You will break them with an iron scepter, you will shatter them like pottery. I believe that's coming in Revelation. When Jesus comes back, he will break the kings of this earth. So I think Psalm 2 is still got a prophecy that's still coming, and it will be fulfilled. But it was not fulfilled with Constantine. And here's the big question. Because Christians still use Augustine for just war. But what would Augustine say now that the kings of the earth are no longer Christian? What would Augustine say now that the kings are plotting against the anointed one and his Messiah? The kings of the earth are teaching sexual immorality. The kings of the earth are teaching things that are against Christ, that are blasphemous against God. So, should Christians now no longer participate in the military? I would think if you use Augustine's logic to justify participating in the military, you should also use his logic to now reject participation in the military. So if you're someone who currently believes in the just war theory, you should go back and look at Augustine's teaching. Because now there's no longer a king of the earth that's really, I would say, aligned with the Messiah. You need to think about that. Think about his logic. Think about the 400 years before Augustine who did not go by Augustine's logic and participating in the military and into government. So to me, this is just proof that Augustine's interpretation of Scripture is wrong. Because he could not see what would come into modern times. We don't even have fake Christian rulers now. We are Christian. Our rulers pretty much tell you that, well, I shouldn't say that. We do have rulers who say they're Christian, but if you look at the rules, they'll say they're Christian one time, but they'll say another religion is just as true as theirs, which I don't know how you can be a Christian and have those beliefs. So I don't see any real Christian leader today. So let's keep going with the problems of Augustine's logic. He does not apply the Old Testament verses that limit the wars of a godly king. Deuteronomy 17, the king is limited in building a strong army. I've done videos on this in my Matthew 10 series. Deuteronomy 20, Israel cannot demand its citizens to fight in wars. They have to say, hey, if you want to go home, go home. I don't want people who are afraid to fight. I only want those who are willing to fight. Exodus 30, a military census is a bad thing. God was going to bring a plague on their people unless they paid an atonement price. An atonement price. To keep God from killing them. Numbers 1, a small segment of society is set apart for God and cannot be counted as soldiers. So in the Old Testament, God took the Levites. And just as, well, go back all the way to Exodus. In Exodus, God killed all the firstborn who did not have the blood of the lamb over their doors. When God pulls the nation of Israel out, he tells them, you owe me your firstborn. But instead of taking your firstborn, I'm going to take the tribe of Levi. And then God takes the tribe of Levi for his very own purpose. And so I don't hear people who advocate for Augustine in participating in war. I don't see them, or even the Old Testament, I don't see them applying what God applied in the Old Testament. So in my mind, why did God have all these limitations on war in the Old Testament? And it's pretty simple. How would God be known to the nations around Israel if Israel defeated them with lots of chariots and lots of horses and advanced weapons? How would people know that, hey, their God's the true God? But when Israel has military victories, and they've got a third of the number of troops, they don't have chariots, their swords aren't as good. When you're coming across an army and you're like, this army is puny, and they end up defeating you, what do you think you're going to say? Obviously, you're going to say your God is not the true God, and their God is the true God. So God put these limitations on the nation of Israel. One, they'd have to put faith in him for military victory. And two, others should see clearly that the God of Israel is the true God, and they should come and follow that true God. No, not even Christians put these conditions on Christian nations, and neither did Augustine. So if God limited war in the Old Testament, if he limited war in the Old Testament, then don't you think that the Messiah, when he came, don't you think his kingdom would be even more limited in war? It's only logical to me that if God defeated these armies in the Old Testament with these huge armies that had chariots and horses, if God defeated these huge armies with just a small number of Jews that didn't have horses, that didn't have just great weapons, that were smaller and just say even weaker, if God was able to take this small group and defeat these huge armies, what do you think the Messiah's army would be like? I would say the Messiah's army would maybe be weaker. So that God would get even more glory. It doesn't make sense that the Messiah's army would be better than any other army. That's not the way God had functioned in the Old Testament, not the way he's functioned in the New. So what happened? So how do we get to the point now where Christians have committed all these atrocities? Well, the bottom line is Satan Satan being the schemer, found out how to steal, kill, and destroy, and he found out a way that he could pollute God's name in the process. So just a note, the heart of man is incredibly wicked. Even when God clearly tells us we're to love our enemies, and he tells us here's the path we should walk down, we still just corrupt his teachings. And I think that's just what happened. We have corrupted his teachings. The Gentiles are no different than the Jews as far as rejecting the truth. If you look at how Jesus summarized the Old Testament, is often the Jews as a whole. Like when he comes to Jerusalem and he says, hey, I just want to come to you and just gather you all together. But hey, you keep stoning the prophets I sent to you. And sometimes we look at Jews like, can't believe they did that. Well, here Jesus gave us clear teachings on nonviolence, and we've rejected it. And if anyone stands up and says, hey, we need to be nonviolent, they often get killed too by those who are violent. So the Gentiles have rejected the clear teachings of God, just like the Jews have rejected the clear teachings of God. So many who claim to be the followers of Jesus also crave the sword and power in this world over the cross of Christ. God in the end will be the righteous judge. And the traditions began by Augustine continued through the Catholic Church, and even when the Protestant denominations broke away from the Catholic Church, they continued these same teachings. They did not completely go sola scriptura. There's no way they could have gone sola scriptura and still practice Augustine's just war. And so they kept those traditions. And so another problem we have today is Protestant denominations, especially mine, I will say the Southern Baptists, we do not study early church history. That's something you get into when you're in seminary. I've never been to seminary. I had to go and just read books on my own to find this stuff out. But that's why I've done video after video after video on early church teachings on nonviolence. You won't find this normally in a Protestant church. However, we'll still teach the just war theory. People support sending Christians to war, but they really don't know what's the background of that. What's the theological background? What does that come from? We just don't teach that. And so, why does nonviolence matter? So, would you want to know if your church had a teaching that was contrary to the early church? Do you? Do you want to know if your church teaches something different than what the church that Peter and Paul and Matthew and Luke, all those guys who were in that early church, Mark, we can just keep going. So, if you had a teaching that was different from all those guys, John, the apostle, would you like to know if you teach something different than what John was trying to teach in the book of Revelation, or John was trying to teach in his gospel? Wouldn't you want to know? And so I want to know if I'm teaching something that's contrary to what those early Christians believed. 2 Peter 2, 1 and 2, Peter clearly said that there were indeed false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, and will bring swift destruction on themselves. Here's the sad part. Many will follow their depraved ways, and the way of truth will be maligned because of them. There are teachers, and here I think Augustine, at least this particular teaching of his, it has maligned. The way of truth was maligned because of him. And this is the danger of a false teacher. And it says it is what I believe as far as nonviolence. Nonviolence is a future teaching of the church. See the book of Revelation. Christians are the ones being persecuted. Remember what I was saying earlier in this video? There's a group of Christians who are contrary to Augustine saying, hey, Christians should be the ones being persecuted. Well, they're just reading the book of Revelation. Look in Revelation. We're the ones being persecuted. Outside of the two witnesses and Jesus coming back with his army, all you see in that particular book is Christians being persecuted. So let's keep going. So then, would God destroy his followers for not knowing? So here we are approaching the end times. And in Hosea 4:6 says, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. So one thing I want to make sure, if you're watching this video, I just want to hopefully give you knowledge so you won't be destroyed. Because we are approaching the end times. And when the end times come, I think there will be a lot of God's people who will be destroyed because they want to jump in the military and they want to they believe that's how they are to serve God. But I'm going to say, point to the early church. You will die in the end times, but I pray it's for telling others about Jesus and not for participating in the military. So here we go. What now? I say teach the message of the early church pertaining to Isaiah 2 and 4. So I've tried to work on the Christian Guidebook to War and Peace. It needs some work. I'm sure there's some flaws. If you go read it, I'm sure there's some flaws in it. It needs some correcting. But it's at www.thoughtsofwar.org. You can share my YouTube videos in them. I've made tons of videos on nonviolence. Challenge believers, do their own research. When someone approaches them about nonviolence and just war, point them back. Say, hey, go look at the history of that. Go look at the history of the early church. Do what you believe match up with the early church? And as the end time approaches, I truly believe the church will again beat her swords into plowshares. I'm hoping to do some more videos on the end times. Hopefully this will be a pause for a little bit on the early church. I want to get back into end times and some other events. But that's it. Thanks for watching. If you've not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe.